600 feet below the surface of the Pacific, the Aegir 7 station is a bubble of glass and titanium held together by pure atmospheric pressure. It is a world where a single hairline crack is a death sentence. When an undersea tremor shattered the primary airlock and flooded the lower decks, the crew was trapped in a rapidly shrinking pocket of oxygen. The external comms were severed, and the emergency beacon was stuck in a flooded corridor. This is the story of Riptide, a chocolate Labrador with a chest like a barrel and a soul that belonged to the ocean. The Guardian of the Iron Deep. Chapter 1: The Mariner's Soul. The Aegir 7 research station was a marvel of human stubbornness, a cluster of titanium spheres anchored 600 feet below the surface of the Pacific. At this depth, the ocean is not a place of light and color, but a world of eternal twilight and immense, invisible weight. The station sat on the edge of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, a frontier of bioluminescent monsters and jagged underwater canyons. For the scientists inside, the 6-inch thick acrylic viewports were the only thing preventing the ocean from instantly reclaiming the space they occupied. In this pressurized sanctuary lived Riptide. He was a chocolate Labrador with a chest as broad as a barrel and a coat that seemed to repel water like oil. While most dogs find their joy in the park, Riptide had been raised on the rolling decks of deep-sea trawlers and the cramped quarters of research vessels. He was a mariner's dog, possessing an uncanny ability to find his footing even when the station swayed under the influence of massive deep-ocean currents. To Riptide, the constant hum of the life support systems was the heartbeat of his home. While the humans were distracted by their monitors and mineral samples, Riptide was tuned into the station's voice. He understood the difference between the normal creak of the hull expanding and the sharp, metallic ping of a bolt under too much stress. He would often spend hours with his head cocked toward the primary bulkheads, listening to the music of the deep. He was the only creature on Aegir 7 who didn't look at the ocean as a hostile environment. To him, the water was simply an extension of the pack's territory. Riptide's role on the station was more than just companionship. He was a moral anchor for the 3-person crew who spent months at a time in the dark. In the claustrophobic silence of the abyss, Riptide's steady, rhythmic tail thump against the metal floor was a reminder of the world above. He was the analog soul in a digital world, a creature of fur and warmth in a place defined by cold steel and salt. He didn't need a sonar screen to know if something was approaching the station. He could feel the displacement of the water in his very bones. As the midnight hour approached on the night of the tremor, Riptide became uncharacteristically restless. He paced the circumference of the observation dome, his nose twitching at the air vents. He could smell the subtle change in the minerals being pushed up from the sea floor, a scent of ancient sulfur and grinding stone. While the crew slept, the dog stood guard at the main hatch, his amber eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. He knew that Iron Deep was about to wake up, and it was hungry the fracture. The disaster didn't begin with a roar, but with a shudder that felt like the earth itself was clearing its throat. A localized tectonic shift, no more than a few inches of movement on the sea floor, sent a shockwave directly into the Aegir 7's foundation. The station groaned, its titanium legs grinding against the basalt anchors. Inside the observation dome, the crew was thrown from their bunks as the emergency lights flickered into a haunting, pulsing red. The silence of the deep was replaced by the terrifying sound of screaming metal. The primary airlock, the umbilical cord that connected the living quarters to the escape pods, had reached its breaking point. Years of micro-corrosion from the salt-heavy environment had weakened a single seal. Under the sudden stress of the tremor, the seal vanished. A jet of high-pressure seawater, moving with enough velocity to cut through bone, exploded into the main corridor. It wasn't just a leak, it was a breach. The ocean was no longer outside the station, it was inside, and it was moving with the force of a tidal wave. Automatic safety protocols kicked in with cold, mechanical indifference. The heavy blast doors, the bulkheads, slammed shut with a deafening thrum, sealing off the flooded sections. However, the timing was catastrophic. The crew, led by Commander Elias, found themselves trapped in the observation dome, the highest point of the station. They were safe for the moment, but the surge had wiped out the primary comms array and the main oxygen generators. They were now in a pressurized tomb, breathing a finite supply of air that would last less than 4 hours. Elias checked the internal sensors, his face pale in the red light. "The emergency beacon," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's in the locker at the end of the service tunnel." The service tunnel was the lowest part of the station, now completely submerged under 20 feet of freezing, turbulent water. The beacon was the only way to signal the surface fleet for a deep submergence rescue. Without it, they were just 3 more ghosts added to the graveyard of the Pacific. The water was already beginning to seep. Under the bulkhead door, a dark, oily pool that reflected the frantic movements of the scientists. They looked at the dive suits hanging in the airlock, but the airlock was on the other side of the flood. They were trapped without equipment, without a radio, and without a way to swim through the high-pressure darkness of the tunnel. Riptide stood at the edge of the rising water, his hackles raised, staring into the black depths of the flooded hatchway. The suicide swim. Elias looked at the water, then at Riptide. A human's lungs would collapse under the pressure fluctuations of the flooded tunnel, and the cold would induce shock in seconds. But a Labrador was built for the water, and Riptide had spent his life in the iron deep. His barrel chest held a massive lung capacity, and his thick, double-layered coat was a natural wetsuit. It was a suicide mission, a pressure run through a collapsing maze, but Riptide was the only one who had a chance of making it back. "Rip, look at me," Elias said, kneeling in the rising water. He took a high-intensity strobe light and the beacon-triggering remote and lashed them to Riptide's heavy-duty harness with paracord. The dog looked into Elias's eyes, his tail giving a single, steady thump against the metal. There was no fear in the dog's gaze, only a quiet, predatory focus. He understood that the pack was in danger, and he knew that the water was his domain. The plan was simple and terrifying. Riptide would have to swim through the main corridor, navigate the debris of the collapsed galley, and reach the storage locker 60 feet away. Once there, he had to retrieve the beacon, a 5-pound floating unit, and bring it back to the dome. One breath. One chance. If he got snagged on a wire or trapped by a shifting piece of furniture, the ocean would claim him, and the crew would follow shortly after. Elias cracked the manual override on the bulkhead. A wall of freezing water pushed into the room, rising to their waists. "Go, Riptide. Find the beacon. Bring it home." With a powerful shove of his hind legs, the chocolate lab dove into the dark. The transition from air to water was seamless. Riptide was no longer a land animal. He was a shadow in the deep, his powerful paws churning the water as he vanished into the black throat of the service tunnel. Inside the tunnel, the world was a nightmare of floating wires and jagged metal. The strobe on Riptide's back flashed, casting rhythmic, ghostly blue light against the collapsing walls. The pressure pressed against his eardrums, but he didn't stop. He navigated by the feel of the current, pushing through the cold with a singular, iron-willed purpose. He was a retriever, and he had been given the most important fetch of his life. Chapter 4: The Pressure Run. Riptide moved through the galley, the strobe light reflecting off floating trays and shattered glass. The water was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and salt, but his instincts guided him toward the end of the hall. His lungs were beginning to burn, the oxygen in his blood screaming to be replenished, but the Labrador's heart was steady. He reached the locker room, the blue light of the strobe revealing the beacon locker at the very back of the flooded chamber. The locker door was held shut by the pressure of the flood. Riptide didn't have hands to turn a handle, but he had the raw strength of a dog who had spent years pulling anchors and hauling nets. He wedged his muzzle into the narrow gap between the door and the frame, using his powerful neck muscles to pry the metal back. The hinges groaned, a metallic scream that echoed through the water. With a final, desperate heave, the locker popped open and the emergency beacon floated free. He grabbed the beacon's handle in his jaws, the hard plastic biting into his gums. The beacon was buoyant, trying to pull him toward the ceiling, but Riptide used his weight to keep it steady. He turned back toward the observation dome, but the way was now blocked. A secondary collapse had sent a heavy server rack sliding across the corridor, narrowing the path to a tiny, jagged opening. His lungs were on fire now, the urge to gasp for air becoming an almost physical pain. He didn't panic. He flattened his body, pushing the beacon ahead of him through the gap. The jagged edge of the server rack caught his flank, tearing a line through his fur and skin, but he didn't let go. He kicked with his back legs, the water churning behind him as he squeezed through the constriction. He was losing strength, his movements becoming sluggish as the ice sleep of the deep began to pull at his consciousness. The light of the observation dome was a faint, red smudge in the distance. Riptide focused on that light, his paws moving in a rhythmic, mechanical beat. He wasn't swimming for himself, he was swimming for the smell of Elias's jacket and the sound of the crew's voices. He was a creature of the pack, and the pack was waiting for the light. With one final, agonizing surge of energy, he broke through the debris and headed for the surface. Chapter 5: The Recovery. Inside the observation dome, the air was thick and foul. The oxygen levels had dropped to the critical 5% mark, and the scientists were slumped against the viewports, their breathing shallow and labored. Elias stared at the water, his eye searching for a flash of blue light. "He's not coming back," one of the scientists whispered, his voice a dry rasp. But Elias didn't look away. He knew Riptide. He knew that dog wouldn't stop as long as his heart was beating. Suddenly, the water erupted. Riptide breached the surface, gasping for air in a series of wet, frantic huffs. He swam to the edge of the rising waterline and dropped the beacon at Elias's feet. He was shivering violently, his brown fur matted and bleeding, but his eyes were bright with triumph. He let out a single, loud bark, a sound of pure defiance against the abyss. He had done it. He had brought the spark of life back from the iron deep. Elias grabbed the beacon with shaking hands and slammed the primary trigger. A high-frequency distress signal shot upward through the water, piercing the surface and hitting the rescue satellites in orbit. 100 miles away, a Navy recovery vessel picked up the signal. "EJ-7 is alive," the radio operator shouted. "Deploy the DSV. We have a lock." The rescue was in motion, but the clock was still ticking. For the next 2 hours, the crew huddled together in the dark, the water now reaching their chests. Elias held Riptide close, the dog's body heat the only thing keeping them from the early stages of hypothermia. Riptide's breathing was heavy, but he remained alert, his ears swiveling toward the hull. He was the first to hear it, a low, rhythmic thrumming from the outside. It wasn't the ocean, it was the propellers of the Deep Submergence Vehicle, DSV. The DSV docked with the upper emergency hatch with a metallic clunk that was the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. The hatch opened, and fresh, pressurized air flooded the dome. Rescuers in black dive suits dropped down, pulling the exhausted scientists into the safety of the submersible. But Elias wouldn't go first. He lifted Riptide into the arms of a rescuer, the dog's tail giving a weak, grateful wag. The Guardian was finally being relieved of his post. The surface breath. When the DSV finally broke the surface of the Pacific, the sun was rising in a blaze of gold and crimson. The air was sweet and salty, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang of the station. As the hatch opened, Riptide was the first to stick his nose out, taking a massive, joyful breath of the morning air. He was covered in bandages, and his coat would forever carry the scars of the service tunnel, but he was standing on his own 4 feet on the deck of a ship. The EJ-7 incident became a landmark case in deep-sea survival, but the technical reports couldn't capture the heart of the story. Riptide became a legend among the global research community. He was the only dog ever to be awarded the Maritime Medal of Valor, and he received a lifetime commission as a chief safety officer for the fleet. He no longer lives under the pressure of the abyss, he spends his days on the sun-drenched decks of surface vessels, watching the waves he once conquered. Elias and Riptide remained inseparable. On cold nights, when the wind reminds Elias of the whistling air vents of the station, Riptide is there to rest his heavy head on Elias's knee. The dog still sleeps with one ear cocked toward the floor, a habit from the days when he had to listen for the voices of the hull. He knows that the ocean is vast and deep, but he also knows that no depth is too great for a heart that refuses to sink. Today, Riptide is a common sight in the ports of the West Coast. He is the dog who conquered the pressure, a chocolate lab who looked into the black eyes of the Pacific and didn't blink. He is a reminder to every sailor and scientist that while technology can fail and titanium can crack, the bond between a human and their dog is an anchor that can hold firm in any storm. He is the spirit of the sea, wrapped in brown fur. As the research vessel heads out for another mission, Riptide stands at the bow, his ears flapping in the salt spray. He watches the blue water go by, knowing that he is a part of it, yet master of it. He lets out a contented woof at a passing dolphin, his amber eyes reflecting the endless horizon. The iron deep is behind him, the sun is above him, and the guardian of the abyss is finally at peace. Riptide was a dog in a world of steel and salt, but he proved that the strongest anchor is the one that never lets go of its family. He showed us that even in the deepest, darkest places on Earth, bravery knows no limits. If Riptide's incredible underwater rescue moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to Paws That Saved Lives. We bring you the most breathtaking animal stories ever told. Comment deep below if you think dogs are the ultimate guardians of the sea.